Hello and welcome everybody for this next call in our S&M conversation series. So Steve, I think we should just get started even though people are still arriving.
Yeah.
And you want to say a few things?
A few things.
Yes, a few things.
Well, now I've said a few things. Shall we begin?
Okay.
I'm just being silly. Yeah, let's begin. Let's begin.
Okay. So Tanya already was fast on the trigger. So Tanya.
Hello. I had the very pleasure to be in the last nonlinear movement class. So I have two questions. One is sort of like an afterthought to the nonlinear movement, and the other one relates to rhythm and sleep rhythm, I guess. So I've always kind of asked myself, you know how usually, it's sort of like the golden rule in Ayurveda and different traditions, like the sleep before midnight is sort of like the most regenerative sleep, and that's what you really need, for your body to really get that energy that regenerates your cells and all of that. But I've always been thinking, I don't know if you actually have that in English. In Germany, we say, there's owl people and there's larks. So the owls, they like to really, stay up late during the night, and the larks, they rise early in the morning and go to bed early. But the owls, they like to stay up late. And I'm a total owl person, and I can't really get myself to get to bed before like 1:30 in the morning. And I can't really figure out why that is. I think part of it is I really, really, really enjoy the stillness that comes when the majority of people go to bed. So there's just, I would almost say, like, there's no time during the day that I feel more creative and expanded and free than I do around midnight and the time after. But I remember you saying something during the nonlinear movement, saying like, a lot of us actually really live on adrenaline. And when you said that, there was just something in me that was like, gosh, I wonder if I'm using this energy that comes during that time that's actually meant for your body, if I'm using that in other ways. And so it's actually in a way more of a way to take something that's meant for regeneration. So that's one thing. It's like, I can't really figure out. I've just sort of, asked myself many times, what is it that I'm doing? Why? Like 1:30 is sort of this compromise of saying, okay, if I don't go to bed by now, I'm going to be in trouble. If it was up to me, I would actually prefer to, I could stay up until 4 and I'd be super happy. It doesn't mean that I feel very good the next day. So yeah, any thoughts on natural rhythms? I would welcome. That's one thing. And the other thing I can, if I can.
Are they related, or is the other thing something totally different?
The other thing is, after the nonlinear practice on Tuesday, I kind of haven't slept since then, more or less, because I hit up on a trauma level that feels as if I'm really, part of me is really super hung up in fight and flight. And so I've had the sensation of, how when you're kind of drifting off either during meditation or when you're almost about to fall asleep, and then, something, the nervous system won't really shut off. And so I've had this, I would say this is a trauma response. I've had this sensation for, several nights in a row now, to where, I'm trying to fall asleep and then I can't, because the nervous system is kind of not letting go. And so I've just sort of to relax with it anyways, and just, stay present with that. And I can rest even when I don't sleep. I think I've never really needed a lot of sleep. So my question would be like, is there any other way that you would, suggest to move through that other than just being with it?
Okay, they do hang somewhat together. Steve, do you want to start or shall I?
Yeah, you go ahead.
Okay, good. Okay, so I think first thing to say is that sleep is one of those really interesting things, right? It's been quite researched, and there is, I don't think, much conclusive things other than what you hear, which is you should sleep before midnight, and it's the REM states that are regenerative, and only after you've essentially repaired your body can you then have dream states and things like that, right? So we know all of that, but there's an interesting thing that I don't know if you're aware of, and this was actually a European thing, right? Very much so, was that it used to be that people would sleep in two phases. And it was called the two sleeps. And there was a stretch of time between the two sleeps that people were awake. So people would go to bed, this was before electric, wiring came and things like that. People would go to sleep soon after it got dark and then sleep till around 12ish. It depends, different people say different things, and then had like a 2-hour window where they were awake, and then they'd sleep again till the sun would rise.
Wow.
And there's lots of literature, German literature actually, on it, because it was a very common thing, and a lot of composers and writers of the 1600s and upwards, and also the Dutch, wrote very specifically about that, because that in between time was considered the most creative time. That's also usually when people would have kind of more leisurely sex, or they would write something or hang out. It was a time that was considered not encumbered by the demands of your life.
That's right.
And so I'm saying this to say that I think sleep is one of those things that where you create your own rhythm, and where there are certain circadian rhythms within yourself that are more important than the general idea of how it should be done, right? Yeah. And I'm in the night owl, camp as well. However, I usually can't do that because, of life and travel, and well, not at the moment travel, but sunrise and everything. But most people find that those quiet night hours are a time for contemplation and creativity and peace and all of that. And I think that's very important, and I think that's as important as the health benefits of sleeping between 9 and midnight. So I would go with personal circadian rhythms and then check on how that goes with your body. So that's my thing, and I think Steve probably will talk a little bit about that too, because he also has certain creative rhythms. But the other thing that I want to say that fits into that is that you were saying, well, are you pulling from the adrenals, and how, and that your response to having been or having unpacked certain things in the body, right? Having released certain things in the body. It is certainly true that many of us function from a place of pulling from the extra resource of the adrenals. And, we're often used to doing specific activities with a lot of tension and extra tension, like I call it extra push. A lot of that sits up here in the solar plexus and the diaphragm and things like that. So it's worth examining if your actions are happening from that push. It has a kind of a quality to it, or if they're just happening, right? And both is true at certain times. And it's not that there's something wrong with the push or something wrong with using your adrenals. That's what they're there for. It's just that you always have to down regulate and give everybody, in your endocrine system a bit of a break and rest. Now, so now that brings us to the kind of popping up after a release practice, and in general, right? There's a few things that can help quite substantially. One of which is a really quite strong immersion in water. So a long bath, a long shower, a swim, if you are somewhere near a natural body of water, and really work with water as a way to de-escalate your nervous system. So that's one thing. The other thing is you can bounce like on a trampoline, or just by bouncing up and down. So you want your feet flat on the ground and then just move the knees up and down. and just like bounce the whole body, and do lots of bouncing and moving and shaking, and water, and also drink lots of water. And then of course, there's like the tried and true things that about, living in Germany, rescue remedy,
Mhm.
Bach flowers,
Yeah.
stuff like that, that just support the nervous system.
Yeah.
Arnica, very, very good, right?
Passion flower.
Passion flower, exactly. And other than that, just let it take its course. It will take its course. You can, of course, also always do more movement, which will smooth things out further.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful, because I was thinking, what's needed? Is it more restorative? And I did some restorative. I did some yoga nidra and some just restorative yoga, and it took off the edge, but it didn't really bring me down. So movement was not something I had an impulse for. So I'll just try.
Yeah. When in doubt, move.
Yeah.
That's that. When it comes to kind of trauma or very lucid patterns, when in doubt, move your body. Just even if you're laying in bed and you start moving, when that that coming up comes, just move your entire body, right? And then that will actually allow for the future unwinding.
Okay. Yeah, my trauma response is more of a freeze. So
Yeah.
moving, I really have to kick myself into gear then, because the impulse is just not coming naturally.
That's right. Yes. And that's how you know that that's the way to go.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good reminder. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
That,
thanks. Great.
that is really how you know it, right? And also how you know it is when that coming up has a kind of it has an almost like like it has a frozen quality to it, right? You're like almost dizzy or something like that.
Yeah.
That's always the sign that um you're in a freeze, and
Yeah.
it's good to move.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the practice is so powerful. I just, I can't get over how powerful it is. It was such an opening of the whole hip and pelvis and first root chakra. I mean, the opening is almost like, Jesus Christ, there's a part that feels overwhelmed by, how open it is. And so I think that's part of the adjustment, is to just get used to, whoa, there's so much that release. So now the system has to sort of regulate itself to feel safe with that and be okay with it.
Yeah, I know. I'm laughing because I feel the same way. I sometimes go on my mat and I'm like, how can this be? It's just, yeah,
It's
it has
amazing.
quality. You'll be happy to hear we'll announce it on Monday officially. I was working on it when we got on this call. We're doing an online, like 4 modules for a weekend practitioner and teacher
Oh,
training.
awesome.
Even if you don't want to teach, it's going to be loads and loads of practice, and we'll
I'd be very interested in teaching as well, to be honest.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's an amazing practice, because I teach yin yoga, and to add movement to that would be just, I think, just
would be
cool
so good.
combination.
Yeah. So it's coming Monday.
Awesome.
So let you know. I'll make a note.
Super.
Okay.
Great.
Well, thank you. Steve, anything from you?
No, not really. I see here you're asking me to add something in the chat about creativity.
Yes. Well, the reason I'm asking you specifically, I can say that, of course, is that when we talk about sleep cycles, right? You are also the thing that I wanted you to add, if you feel like talking about it, is how you can use fatigue in practice, because I didn't actually talk about the fact that, of course, in practice, there's nighttime practices and late night practices, and how to work with fatigue. And that's something that I know you are really good at, and can talk about. And I think that would be a nice add-on when we talk about sleep and circadian rhythms and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit tangential, but I can comment on it. With creativity, of course, there's different approaches. There's the catch it when it comes approach, inspirational approach, and then there's this sort of discipline approach of logging your hours and consistency and so on. So you're in the right place when inspiration comes, or if it comes, great. If it doesn't, you still work. And those are very different approaches, of course. And so it becomes really a case of quality of time. If you're creative at that time in the morning, you mentioned something about that, and you're regularly getting meaningful or useful, productive, creative work done, then that's good. But if feeling creative at midnight means what it sometimes means for me, which is being very creative with my keyword searches in YouTube and finding lots and lots of really interesting videos about lots of really esoteric and strange subjects that I just get super like, suddenly I know all about epigastric hernias or
Right.
memory devices using online flashcards and so on. It's something I looked at recently about that time of night. Pretty useless, really. You know, I felt like I was totally like in the Matrix, but was it useful? So there's that ruthlessness, I think, that from a creative point of view, one needs to have a ruthlessness, discipline. But that's different for different people. The discipline could be a late night discipline. That's something to say. And as for the feeling of fatigue, I could talk about fatigue and working with sleep and meditation, but it's a bit tangential. Do you think I ought to, or take another question?
We'll take another question if we have time at the end, might be good. I also, by the way, posted in the chat an article about the 2 sleeps.
Oh, cool.
Or you can check that out. There's a book called At Day's Close, Night in Times Past. And that particular book, I should post that too, probably, if I can find it somewhere on Amazon, where they go into the fine detail of how that used to work and why that was a good thing and all of that. So if you're interested, it's just a bit of a nerdy thing, but
yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay. Veronica is saying here in the chat, can you please recommend an exercise to expand your lungs? Sometimes I feel like I'm not getting enough oxygen and have some chest pressure. Well, Veronica, I think the first thing, as always, in cases like that, is you need to make sure that you actually check out, okay, medically, right? So I want to just say that first, is that if you have any lung issues whatsoever, you definitely, and feeling like you don't get enough breath, then you should definitely make sure that you had your lung volume checked, that you've also, had your blood oxygen checked, and a few other things, the way your heart works, so that any kind of organic, or medical issues are ruled out. So that's the first thing to be said, right? When we go past, if we assume that you've done that or that you will do that and you still have that, then there's a few things to look at, one of which is that breath patterns can be impacted by trauma, right? So old trauma or a fresh trauma. And trauma can be anything from acute stress to actually something having happened. And there's essentially the acute fresh moment where you just can't get a lot of air and your breathing's really shallow and it feels like you're grasping for air because something froze you. Or there is the kind of more habitual chronic tension in the chest and in the breath pattern that comes from prolonged stress or certain things that have happened. So I am not an expert by any means in pranayama, in breath practice, because it's a very small portion of what I teach or practice myself. And there's only a couple of breath practices that I've done in my lifetime sufficiently to say something about them. But there is lots and lots of pranayama instruction, which is is specific breath instruction where you work on relaxing your diaphragm and kind of open your lungs. And in general, the most oxygen gets absorbed in the back of the lungs and in the lower lobes of the lungs, which are far down. So diaphragmatic breathing is what is usually suggested for that. And I'm sure you can find some really good instruction on that. But another one, and Veronica says here, it's she's been checked out medically. She thinks it's fear. She can't get her microphone to work. So in that case, I would work with the diaphragmatic breathing, on the actual muscle side of things, because of course muscles contract and atrophy, and we have these little muscles between the ribs that can get quite weak and that can hurt when you do more exercise than usual and things like that. So, so diaphragmatic breathing, in general, working with your breath, if that's something that you choose to do. And like I said, I'm not a big fan of breath practice for a number of reasons. It sounds like for you it would be a good idea, but I would take a different approach as well. And the approach that I would take is away from the structure of the inhale, hold, exhale on the breath, on the count of 2 or whatever. What I would do probably is sing and move. And ideally sing with a lot of abandon and very loudly, maybe in the shower or in the privacy of your own home. I used to sing in my car on the way between Vienna, where I went to school, and Salzburg, where my parents lived. I'd have a mixtape for the entire 3 hours, and I'd be singing on top of my lungs for the entire 3 hours. So I would work with breath in a passive way by singing and making sounds and moving the body and relaxing the solar plexus. So that would be my go-to recommendation, in addition to maybe doing some more structured practice. All right, and Veronica says, thank you, that sounds great. So thanks, Veronica. Okay, anyone else, anything? Oh, Tanya saying, why am I not a fan of breath work? Well, for a number of reasons, but I think, Steve, that might be a nice thing for you to talk about, because that is more your domain, the natural breath. And maybe if you have time, you could maybe lead a tiny little bit of that breath, that non-breath breath practice.
Yeah, could do. You want me to answer why you're not a fan of breath work?
Why? Yeah, well, one of the things is
Michaela was once cut off in traffic by a breath work teacher, and she's never liked it since.
No, but can you talk a little bit about natural breath versus forced breath?
Yeah, of course. And we'll see. You can comment then if this is somewhat related to what you were saying there. There are many breath practices, of course, in all kinds of different traditions and all kinds of different approaches, from just fitness-related breath work to breath that's supposed to, holding your breath for large amounts of time to trigger certain states of bliss or something like this in the body, or to simulate a near-death experience through breath control, or to get the body totally jazzed up through holotropic breathing or Kapalabhati kind of stuff. So there's really, you can try to slow down the metabolism, trying to jack up the metabolism. Practices like Tumo, the Tibetan inner heat practice, has a component of breath which is vital to it. And that's sort of actively controlling the breath. And there's a whole other category of breath practice where you watch the breath, right? And I think when often people think of meditation, that's what they think of, watching the breath. It's a sort of iconic practice. You don't do anything to it, you just watch it. And then there are practices where you watch it and do something to it. There is a misnomer, I think, that a deep breath is a spiritual breath. It's very interesting. There's a process mistake there, I think. So it's taken sometimes to be that if you have a deep breath or a full breath, that you're a trustable person or a deep person or a spiritual person or something of that nature, or an embodied person. The idea being that shallow breath often comes from disembodiment, tension, etc., etc. That's the idea. And the process mistake is that just because A produces consequence B does not mean that the presence of B reveals the presence of A. What do I mean by that? Well, if I come to you and I say, I'm wet because I got rained on, it's raining so I'm wet. Next day I show up, I'm wet again. You can say, aha, you're wet, must have been raining. But it's possible I fell in a swimming pool. In both instances, I'm wet. The end result is the same. The breath is deep. But it doesn't mean that the deep breath is a consequence of the same cause. So it's often said that a deep breath is the evidence, let's say, of a certain sort of fullness of embodiment. Let's just say, for argument's sake, that that's true, a depth of embodiment. Let's say that everybody with a certain depth of embodiment has a certain kind of deep breath. We'd have to see if that's true or not, but let's just take that as an argument, just for the sake of thinking about it. Even if that's true, imposing a deep breath on your body does not make you necessarily, does not give you the cause. You're wet, but for a different reason. And so my old yoga teacher, Godfrey, used to say that layering tension over tension to give the illusion of openness. That's what he used to describe a lot of breath practice as, layering tension over tension to create the illusion of openness. In other words, let's say there's tension in your breathing that restricts your breath to some degree. So then you engage in practices, forcing the breath deeper, pressing the torso open, layering tension over tension to give the illusion of openness, let's say, in the breathing mechanism. What you're really doing in a certain sense is you're adding to the problem. It's like taking out a credit card to pay off your credit card. Still more credit cards, right? You might even be compounding the problem. So what is often suggested, well, it's not actually often suggested. What's often suggested is breathe deeper and you'll become more embodied. That's what's often suggested. I think it's a mistake. Where Godfrey would start, and I like this, is that he starts with the free breathing. The idea is that, so that's the foundation really, to acquire a certain intimacy with the breath, an ability to feel the breath as it is before optimizing it, before doing anything to it. That's a sort of foundation. If we jump into manipulating the breath without having contacted the breath clearly, then we've skipped a step. It's a little bit like dating somebody and immediately trying to improve them. A wise step would be to get to know the person before you commit. So you know the extent of the renovations, you know the degree to where are you starting, and where would you like to go with it, etc., etc. You see my point, I think. So it has all sorts of actually interesting corollaries to things like relationships with people or relationships with your body or relationships to different things. Very often we're straight away changing, fiddling, acting upon before we've even really made contact or established some sort of intimate connection there. So anyway, that's that first step of intimacy with the breath. And that's a great place to start. And very often what can happen if there's restriction or there's habitual holding in the breath, that becomes very obvious. And sometimes what can happen is panic, is a bit of fear can come, or a bit of emotional reactivity can also come. Yogis in particular are prone to this because yoga draws people looking for control. Yoga is often presented as a control of the breath, a control of the body for the sake of chitti vritti nirodha, right? To a kind of quelling or calming of the whirlpools of the mind, this idea of disciplining the body and going in like that. So it attracts people very often who are looking for control, something to control, controlling the body. That's why there's a lot of control issues in people who are attracted to yoga. So not necessarily the case. Not everyone who does yoga is a control freak. That's not what I'm saying. But there can be something interesting there. Think, well, gosh, just breathe without doing anything. But am I not supposed to deepen into my chakra or whatever it is? Am I not supposed to fill out, my extremities with the golden light and so on? Sure, maybe. But the first step of intimacy. Anyway, and when that's been established, that Ishvara Mukta or free breathing, from there, all kinds of interesting pranayama can be done. Lengthening the breath, holding the breath, going fast, going slow, doing all kinds of things. And there's an absolute universe of possibilities there to explore. And so I'm not against breath manipulation or breath control or breath exercises. Personally, I'm not against that. But what I do emphasize is starting from that place of being able to contact the breath before optimizing it in a certain sense, not collapsing the contact and the action step together, basically, something like this. So that's what I emphasize myself. If that way of thinking about the breath appeals, on my podcast, I had Godfrey, who I learned a lot about this sort of thing from. I've had him on a couple of times interviewing him. And he also recorded for the podcast, a free breath class where he introduces it, he teaches a class, and then I quiz him about what he does and what he'd done after that class. So there is something there, and I'll put that in the show notes for people who are interested.
Yeah, it's actually really good.
Would you have anything to add to that, Michaela? Or
No, that damn teacher who cut me off in traffic. You know,
yeah, that was a joke, by the way. I don't think that actually happened.
that was a joke. But you know, the thing that I can add to that is because you know, a big part of my, like, let's say, the body of work, that's my wild woman's way body of work, right, has all to do with rewilding, and rewilding as a means of restoring the natural connection with one's body and the natural world. And of course, within rewilding, there is a very strong orientation towards allowing the body to do what the body does best, which is actually function without us, right? You know, and there is so much imposition on the breath, and so much imposition on the body in general, how it should move and shouldn't move, and how pleasure should be, and what you should tighten and what you should. And that's actually a step that stands in the way of the natural wisdom of the body. And we have bodily wisdom that really, really is way, way older than what we can think about or do about. And it's a bit of a life denying thing when everything about your body has to be controlled. And there is a lot of dogma around breath, particularly, you know, as a means to look spiritual or feel spiritual, as Steve was saying. And I personally had an experience maybe, I don't know, 10 years ago, or about 10 years ago, I'd say. I did kind of a modality of work where you kind of did somatic tracking of tension patterns in the body. And maybe it was about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more. And I remember, you know, you lay on the table in your underwear, actually, you know, almost naked, and they look at your body, and they look at where there's kind of, you know, energetic creases and things like that. And I started, and the practitioner started working on my body, and I started breathing the way I was taught to breathe at some point by someone. And not that I ever really bought into it all the way, but, you know, I was told that this is how you breathe in order to do certain things. And I did, and she started poking me kind of in the ribs and went, "Why are you breathing into the belly? Why are you, you know, why is this not moving? Why is," and she was Israeli, and she was very aggressive in her, you know, in her language, and in her poking in this very, I don't know how to say it. It was really interesting because it's the modality is an Israeli modality, and she had learned it from the founder, and she was like really into it. And she was poking my diaphragm and poking my my ribs, and I was, you know, hell bent on breathing through it. And so she didn't stop till I actually stopped controlling my reaction to her poking and doing these things. And when I did, an enormous amount of trauma and fear response went through my body, because I had used the breath to bypass my natural reaction to the aggression. Right? And that was her teaching lesson back then, right? That I had gotten very good and very passive around the poking that wasn't necessarily physical by people, but just in general, by just breathing and bypassing the entire situation through my breath. And that was extremely instrumental in you know, my connection with my own body around such patterns, and around allowing people to poke me in certain ways. And you know, so that's one of the underlying reasons why I no longer teach breath patterns, other than in more advanced study groups where we use it to do channel work and stuff like that. But then within the understanding that you add that to a naturalized, rewilded body, and not on top of some other stuff. So that's the thought here. Good question. All right, let's see if there's anything else by anyone.
I had experience with breath work, and it was the most, and is that true in your opinion and in your expertise or in your work with breath work, if you whatever you know about that, that it leads you, I mean, that was my impression with just one session that I had with a lady, with music and breath work that she instructed me to do. And I came very deeply, fairly quickly into this strong stage of emotional release. Is that occurring? That's, I think, something that specific work that is done with the breath. And is that safe? And how does one, I mean, for me, it was very intense and I would love to do more of that, but I would like to know, how do I know that the person who is there really needs to be like comforting and being like holding the space and being there with you, because so much is coming up.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're describing, I don't know if the person that you saw was a practitioner, but essentially there is a whole modality called holotropic breath work, which was developed by a man named Stanislav Grof, who is
Stanislav Grof,
yeah,
holographic breath work.
holotropic breath.
Holographic. Oh, that's how it's called. Okay.
Yes, and sometimes people call it rebirthing as well.
But that would be the similar, yeah.
It's
Okay.
the same thing, yes.
Oh, that's the same thing. Okay.
Yes, and that's actually, the holotropic breath work, and Stanislav Grof was a absolute pioneer in his field, and he's not looking at that as a means of pranayama necessarily. He uses it as a healing modality, and it's really, really interesting and powerful. And there is practitioners that are trained really, really well. I don't know if he still teaches himself, but he used to till fairly recently. I know a few people who are established practitioners of his. But so Stanislav Grof developed this as a means to really get things out of a person's body and to have some, quite, like you said, incredible experiences. And part of that has to do with the physiology of oxygenation, hyperoxygenation, what happens in the body, what happens in the brain. There's certain states that are close to death-like, or certain states that are very ecstatic and stuff like that. So in that case, breath is used as a healing modality and not as control, right? And quite interestingly, when you do holotropic breathing properly, right, there's a few different modalities around that. You get quite out of control because, your body starts flailing and all kinds of stuff can happen. And it's safe in the sense that you can stop anytime you want, of course, right? And if you get hyperoxygenated, you will stop breathing for a moment because you have too much oxygen in the body. Because the body, once again, knows really, really well how to regulate oxygen intake. So it's actually not a problem, and it's not dangerous, because you just stop breathing for a moment till your oxygen levels have regulated, then you'll take another breath. But of course, the kind of biochemical brain states that happen when that happens are quite interesting and quite, informative in some ways. And yeah, of course, you have to choose a practitioner who is trustworthy in the sense that they're, not some fly-by-night, I've just discovered this and now I'm going to get people into some states and then I don't know how to deal with them. There is a lot of that, but you avoid that by getting referrals, checking people out. As I said, Stanislav Grof has trained and certified practitioners. You can also read his book. It's really good. And there's loads of videos out on YouTube. There's all kinds of really good stuff around that. But I certainly wouldn't describe that as a breath practice in the classic sense. That's kind of a healing practice and quite full on. I once was at Esselen teaching. This was quite a few years ago. It was probably my first time teaching at Esselen, actually. And there was a Groff breathwork workshop next door, practitioner workshop next door. And I had to request eventually changing rooms because the racket was just unbelievable. I mean, but then people would come out and they'd be like these, shining, wide open, totally, like glowing people. And they'd float into the dining room and have like 3 pieces of lettuce or something like that, because they were just so expanded. And it was really great to see. And I kind of did like a public session at some point, like where you could check it out. And I went in there and it was really cool. So it was just many years ago. Yeah, thank you.
I have a question that revolves around the movement classes that we've been doing and also the meditation that we did the other day, Steve, for your meditation club. And one of the things that I've been experiencing during this COVID situation is just a really deep down regulating of all of the activity that I do, that I used to do, and I'm not doing it anymore. And in the beginning, it felt really uncomfortable, but now I'm starting to get to the point where I'm noticing there's parts of myself that are relaxing that I wasn't even able to notice before. And when we did the meditation, Steve, the other day, where we were going, we were noticing the body, and then we were noticing the space before the body, and it was like we were going back and forth, like is it the black zebra with the white stripes, or is it a white zebra with black stripes? And I feel like during this time where I'm starting to relax more than I thought I could relax, it's feeling so pleasurable that I'm not getting the things done that I feel like I need to get done because there's so much crap I had going on before. And I'm just wondering, is there some connection between that meditative state and doing things that is like really relaxed versus doing things because it's anxiety, because I'm in this pattern of anxiety, and so I have to constantly be doing shit to keep myself busy because it's a habit? And how do I recognize that in the moment, and how do I make that okay? It's like I feel like I've been doing all this stuff for so long, and I'm finally starting to relax now. And there's this weird guilt that I have because I'm not doing all this stuff that I feel like I need to do. And so that's that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's very interesting. What sort of stuff is it that you think you should be doing?
Well, it's just, painting chairs, cleaning barn out, putting a little thing here, planting a little thing there. It's just this stuff that's unnecessary. It's all these, like before, oh my God, I was having so much, I would have, one day I would go get a facial. The next day it was constant body work being done. I need to go get a massage because that's part of the schedule. I need to go on this cleanse. I need to do this. I need to do that. Like, I guess I have this weird guilt thing in my head that if I'm not constantly doing all this stuff, that it's just going to fall apart. That's probably just old patterning.
Well, you might be right, of course. It's hard to say. Is the stuff problematic, or is it what motivates the activity that's problematic? In other words, if you could paint the chair without it being a cover for anxiety, would you be all right to be still quite busy if you weren't driven by so much of this anxiety? Or do you want to cut the stuff out? Is that also what you want?
Well, I'm finding that this stuff is creating the anxiety because I put this idea in my head that this thing has to get done. And then I'm like, oh God, these fucking chairs are sitting in the garage for a month and a half waiting to get painted. And they don't even need to be painted. I mean, it's just this idea that I have of doing these things that aren't even necessary, and filling my life up with all this stupid stuff, you know, and then now feeling this sense of guilt because I'm not staying on top of things. I'm not keeping things organized as well as I should. I mean, you know, but I'm thinking to myself, what was I doing? Like, why was it had to have been because of anxiety, just constantly trying to keep myself busy with stupid stuff.
Fair enough. I think I'll let Michaela comment on the, if you want, psychological side,
Okay.
perhaps.
Okay.
But would it be, well, I could keep asking you questions, but we're a little bit running towards the end. So I'll just make a more general comment about motivation in general, what motivates action. And you were asking about how to work with it and clarify it and so on. So, you know, I think it's worth remembering that in times of stress, especially times of chronic stress and uncertainty, you cited the COVID situation as being a really big impact on this whole inquiry you're having. Things do get, can go a little funny and a little weird. And you can start to have swings between very busy and then unable to really get out of bed and do anything. And that's, you know, to be expected in a situation like this. It may not necessarily happen, but it's certainly within the realms of possibility. And I've heard from people who are very effective people, very experienced people, who have been surprised that that's happened to them. People saying, you know, I can't get out of bed, and, you know, or I find myself running around doing things all day, but I'm not really accomplishing anything. Right. And they say, I know it's because it's this, you know, I'm worried about the pandemic and so on, and I'm stressed out about it. And they're surprised that them being very experienced people would suffer from that. But human beings are human beings. So the smart thing, I think, is initially to recognize that in a certain way is to be expected. From a meditation point of view, one of the things you figure out in meditation that you're pointing to and you're discussing is that you realize a lot of times the reason you do things isn't the reason you think you're doing it. Classic example of meditation, you're sitting there doing your meditating and you want to scratch your nose. Now, there's no law against scratching your nose in meditation, unless you're in a very strict Zen meditation, then they might hit you with a stick. But there's no law against it. But it's often you're encouraged not to all the time scratch your nose. Here I am scratching my neck. Because you discover something if you don't. So you're sitting there and think, oh, I've got such an itchy nose. I've got such an itchy nose. Turns out, and then you don't scratch the nose. And then it turns out beneath the tip of the iceberg, which is scratch the nose, there's this whole mass of motivational structure. Turns out you were bored. It's like when you eat Pringles because you're lonely. I could really fancy some Pringles. And then, but actually what's really going on, let's say, is that I'm so terribly lonely. I know, Pringles, right? And you're not aware of those deeper motivations. I don't think this is news to anybody, really. But one of the things that can happen in meditation when you're sitting there and you're just not acting, one of the things about meditation, you're not doing anything. You're not getting up for the Pringles or scratching your nose or painting the chair or answering the emails. Good activities. It's not that scratching your nose is wrong or painting the chair is wrong. But one of the things you have an opportunity to do in meditation is to sit there and let the impulse arise. And then again and again and again, you see what's underneath it. Because in not fulfilling it, this next level of motivation comes up. And then there's a layer beneath that and a layer beneath that. And at the bottom, usually something like fear of death. Or, you know, if I don't act, I'm not alive. It's some sort of thing like that generally. But there's layers of, you see it again and again and again and again and again and again. And eventually you begin to get a little wise to it, essentially. You get a bit wise to it. And you begin to say, oh, okay. And it just gradually get the message, you know. And then rather than say, paint the chair, you say, you can contact, actually, I'm a bit anxious. Rather than going straight to Pringle, you know, rather than your brain going straight to Pringle, you can feel, oh, actually, I can feel the loneliness. I can feel the loneliness. You begin to see a bit more directly through those layers. This has been my experience, and the experience, I think, this is generally said about meditation. So you're asking specifically about meditation. over time with practice, these things tend to be examined. You tend to get some insights about them. Depends on your technique as well. We did a recent Untangle and Be Free workshop, and there's a guided meditation about that on my site as well, where you look at your inner world basically in a systematic way. That's very, very good for breaking down what's really going on inside that's driving your action, etc. But anyway, when a person with an eating disorder, this is something Shinzen says, my main meditation teacher, when a person with an eating disorder improves with their eating disorder, they don't stop eating. They just develop a healthier relationship to eating. Similarly, if you're the sort of person who's a very productive person, you're a high rate person, you like to go out and paint chairs and do stuff, that's a typology. That's might be a strength too. It may not be that you do less. Maybe you develop a different sort of relationship to it. And there can be a bit more ease, for sure. You can just paint the thing. You don't have to stave off your fear of death at the same time as painting the chair. And then that is sometimes said to be what Shinzen would call a Zen bounce, this ability to act with just a lot less dragging you inside. Something like that. That's a whole other topic that I'm afraid we don't have time to go into, which is this idea of acting in a lighter, more effective or efficient, basically a more efficient way due to the work you do on the inside from meditation. That's a whole other really fascinating topic that we could go into at another time.
I'd love that. Thank you.
Yeah. But I mean, we're out of time now, so I think we should call it a day there. But that's a fantastic investigation. What color will you paint the chairs? That's what I want to know.
White.
White. Good choice. Matte or sheen?
It's kind of an off-white, just a little bit, not pure white, but it's off-white. It's an eggshell. It's not shiny and it's not
eggshell. Very good. Nice. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. New nonlinear movement classes are up on the website, and on Monday there'll be a 3-hour creativity-based nonlinear class, and the practitioner training will be up as well. So thank you very much, everybody. Steve's doing meditation every Wednesday. You can check out your time zone, and then on July 5th, I think, you're doing Dimensions of the Heart, which is a 3-hour meditation class.
Yes, with breaks. It's a 3-hour workshop exploring practices of compassion, loving kindness, and all things to do with the heart.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Have a wonderful weekend. Bye.